A black honors student stood frozen at the classroom board, the chalk trembling in his hand. His professor had just written an equation designed to Bill, a trap meant to expose him as a fraud in front of everyone. Laughter rippled through the room, but then, silence. The boy saw something no one else did, a flaw hidden deep inside the problem. In the next heartbeat, he faced a choice: expose the truth, or be erased forever. But what happened when he dared to rewrite the board left the entire campus stunned. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Watch till the end, then rate this story out of 10. Share in the comments below. Your feedback helps us bring you even better stories every single day. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Watch till the end, then rate this story out of 10. Share in the comments below. Your feedback helps us bring you even better stories every single day. The lecture hall was a cathedral of numbers, rows of polished wooden desks stretched upward like pews, the air thick with chalk dust and muted whispers. The clock above the double doors ticked in sharp defiance of the silence, its second hand echoing across the high ceilings. Professor Richard Hale stood at the front, back straight, shoulders square, as if the room itself were his stage. He carried himself with the pride of a man who believed he owned knowledge, and the right to decide who deserved it. The day had begun like any other. Students filed in with laptops and notebooks, filling the seats with the faint rustle of pages and the hum of electronics. But there was something in the way Professor Hale moved that morning, deliberate, calculated, that signaled he was preparing more than a lesson. He turned to the board, lifted a stick of chalk between his fingers, and began to write. The equation appeared piece by piece, symbols and numbers strung together in a chain that looked almost elegant at first glance. Yet to the trained eye it was treacherous. It bent rules, concealed contradictions, and disguised impossibility as logic. By the time he stepped aside, the board carried a monster no ordinary student would dare touch. A hush settled. No one breathed too loudly. It was clear this was no ordinary problem. At the third row, Jamal Carter sat upright, his pencil poised above his notebook. His presence in that hall had always been both invisible and glaring. To the administration, he was their shining example of diversity. A scholarship student from Detroit, brilliant enough to justify his seat in a sea of privilege. But to many classmates, he was the outsider, the one whose achievements were quietly questioned. He felt their eyes sometimes, lingering just long enough to remind him he didn't belong in their world of legacy surnames and inherited opportunities. Jamal studied the equation carefully. He didn't just look at numbers, he lived in them. To him they spoke a language clearer than words. Within seconds, he spotted the flaw, not a mistake, but a trap. The kind of trap someone built deliberately to collapse under scrutiny. His chest tightened as he realized what this was. Professor Hale wasn't challenging the class, he was targeting him. The professor cleared his throat. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is today's challenge," he announced, his voice clipped, every syllable carrying the authority of years. "A test of not just memory, but of discipline, of rigor. It will reveal who among you is prepared, and who among you is not." The words were coated with civility, but Jamal heard the undertone. It wasn't an invitation. It was bait. He saw the professor's eyes glance briefly in his direction. Sharp, expectant, predatory. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some smirked. Others avoided looking at the board altogether. Everyone knew Professor Hale had a reputation. He didn't just teach, he exposed. Stories floated through campus about students broken under his scrutiny, their confidence shattered after a single lecture. But the rumors carried another detail. The weight fell heaviest on students who looked like Jamal. For a moment, Jamal considered lowering his eyes, blending into the anonymity of the room. He could pretend to scribble notes like everyone else, avoid the spotlight, but the silence pressed against him, urging a choice. Professor Hale clasped his hands behind his back, pacing in front of the board like a judge awaiting a confession. Who will be first to try? His question was rhetorical. He already knew the answer he wanted. His gaze lingered again on Jamal. The stillness grew oppressive. A few students whispered, their laughter muffled but sharp enough to sting. Jamal felt the weight of stereotypes hanging over him, the expectation that he would stumble, prove himself unworthy. He gripped his pencil tighter, forcing his breath to steady. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his memory. The countless times she reminded him, "They will doubt you before you even open your mouth." But numbers don't care about their doubts. The professor let the silence stretch, savoring it. Then, in a voice heavy with mock encouragement, he said, "Carter, you look attentive today. Why don't you give it a try?" The room shifted as if on cue. Heads turned, smirks spread, and the trap closed in. Jamal's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. This was no accident. He had been chosen. For an instant, the humiliation of countless past dismissals threatened to surge back. The teachers who overlooked him, the students who mocked him, the guidance counselor who suggested community college instead of advanced study. But underneath the hurt was something else, something simmering, a resolve that had been building for years. Slowly, Jamal placed his pencil down. He rose from his seat, each movement deliberate, steady, denying the professor the satisfaction of hesitation. The lecture hall seemed to narrow, the board towering above like a wall daring him to climb. Every step toward it was heavy with unspoken judgment, but his eyes remained fixed on the equation. He reached the front, the chalk cool and brittle in his hand. The problem loomed, sprawling across the board like a challenge carved in stone. For most, it was chaos. For Jamal, it was a pattern waiting to be revealed. The professor stood nearby, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He had seen this before. Students shaking, sweating, stumbling over symbols until they collapsed under the weight of failure. He expected the same now, but Jamal didn't tremble. He stared at the board, the flaw shining at him like a beacon. The equation wasn't just wrong, it was designed to humiliate. A hush deepened. Even those who didn't care about math leaned forward, drawn to the theater of it all. One young man whispered something cruel under his breath, a comment Jamal chose not to hear. Inside, his mind sharpened, cutting through doubt. This wasn't just about math, it was about dignity, about proving that brilliance could not be erased by prejudice, that no trap could erase years of persistence. He lifted the chalk to the board, heart pounding not from fear, but from focus. The equation glared back at him, mocking, daring him to try. And in that moment, Jamal saw it clearly. The professor hadn't made a mistake. He had built a weapon. Jamal's lips parted slightly as realization set in. The equation was wrong, deliberately wrong. But instead of fear, a quiet fire grew inside him, sharper and hotter than anything he had ever felt before. Jamal stood at the board, chalk pressed between his fingers, the hostile weight of Professor Hale's stare burning into him. The wrong equation stretched across the slate like a wall meant to block him. The silence in the lecture hall became unbearable, yet his mind drifted, unbidden, to the places where silence had always been louder than recognition. For Jamal, numbers had spoken long before people ever listened. Detroit's East Side, where he grew up, was not a place where dreams of higher education were nurtured. Cracked sidewalks led to schools with peeling paint, teachers overworked and underpaid, and textbooks that were years out of date. Yet even there, amid the noise of a city that never forgave poverty, Jamal found order in the chaos. He saw patterns in streetlights flickering down the block, rhythms in the steady rumble of buses, and symmetry in the cracked ceiling above his bed. By the age of 7, he was solving puzzles most adults couldn't finish. At 9, he discovered algebra on his own, flipping through a torn library book no one else had checked out in years. Numbers soothed him. They bent to logic in ways people never did. But when Jamal brought his discoveries to class, eager to share, the response was always the same: disbelief wrapped in dismissal. His third-grade teacher, a tired woman with graying hair, would pat his shoulder and say, "That's nice, Jamal, but let's stick to what's in the workbook." When he corrected an error on the board bones, she told him he was confused and should focus harder. The sting of those moments lingered. He wasn't confused, he was ahead. But being ahead, for a black boy in his neighborhood, was treated as either arrogance or impossibility. At home, though, it was different. His mother, Lena Carter, worked 2 jobs, mornings at a diner, nights cleaning offices downtown. She came home exhausted, smelling faintly of bleach or grease, but her pride in Jamal never dimmed. She didn't understand the equations he scribbled on scraps of paper, but she pinned them to the refrigerator as if they were masterpieces. "You're not crazy, baby," she would whisper after another disappointing parent-teacher conference where his potential was questioned. "You're gifted. Don't let them make you small." It was his grandmother, however, who gave him his first true spark of confidence. She lived across town, in a narrow apartment lined with old books and fading photographs. She had grown up during segregation, barred from schools that might have nurtured her mind, yet she never let bitterness consume her. When Jamal stayed with her on weekends, she told him stories about black scientists, inventors, and thinkers whose names rarely appeared in textbooks. Brilliance, she told him one evening, her voice raspy but strong, has always been in us. They just don't always want to see it. Her words etched themselves into him. Still, knowing the truth and living it were two different things. In middle school, Jamal faced the cruelty of peers. Other boys laughed at him for spending lunch breaks with puzzle books instead of basketballs. Nerd, they called him, though their laughter often carried an undertone sharper than the word itself, as if being smart wasn't just unusual, but unnatural for someone like him. Teachers weren't better. When standardized test scores revealed he had scored far above his grade level, a counselor suggested it might be a fluke. Instead of moving him into advanced courses, they kept him in the same track, insisting he needed stability. He watched classmates with lower scores, white classmates, get placed into enrichment programs. By high school, the barriers grew higher. His school's advanced math classes had limited seats. When Jamal applied, the principal smiled thinly and said, "These courses are very demanding. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer focusing on subjects that fit you better?" The implication was clear. Mathematics didn't fit him. He fought back the only way he could, with results. He stayed up late with borrowed textbooks, teaching himself trigonometry, calculus, and proofs from online resources his neighbors thought were too complicated for anyone. He aced every test thrown his way, forcing teachers to acknowledge his ability. Yet even then, recognition came grudgingly. Teachers praised him privately, but hesitated publicly, as if afraid to admit he was outperforming their favored students. At math club competitions, he was often the only black student in the room. Judges assumed he was on the wrong team until he picked up a marker and solved a problem faster than anyone else. But instead of admiration, his victories often brought resentment. One classmate muttered, "He probably got lucky," after Jamal won first place at a regional contest. Another whispered to a friend, "Bet his coach just fed him the answers." He never forgot the sting of those murmurs, or the way teachers rarely stepped in to defend him. The turning point came during senior year. A statewide mathematics competition offered scholarships to top scorers. Jamal entered, not for recognition, but for survival. Winning meant college could become possible. The night before the competition, his guidance counselor called his mother into a meeting. "He's talented." "Yes," the counselor said carefully, eyes skimming Jamal like he wasn't in the room. "But these competitions can be brutal. If he fails, it could damage his confidence. Maybe it's better not to risk it." Lena's jaw tightened. She turned to her son and said firmly, "You're going." The next day, Jamal walked into a massive auditorium, filled with the state's brightest students. He felt the stares immediately. He was used to them. Some were curious, some skeptical. A few openly hostile. But when the clock started, all that melted away. Numbers danced, and Jamal moved through the questions with a grace that silenced doubt. When results were announced, he had not only won, he had set a record. For the first time, people clapped without hesitation. For the first time, he was undeniable. And yet, in the corner of the room, Jamal noticed one judge shaking his head, as if even victory wasn't enough to erase disbelief. That night, he clutched the scholarship certificate, a golden ticket out of limitation. But he also carried the weight of knowing that brilliance wouldn't shield him from prejudice. And now, years later, standing in Professor Hale's classroom, that weight returned in full. The professor's smirk wasn't new. The stares of classmates weren't new. They were the same shadows from his childhood, just dressed in sharper suits and higher stakes. Jamal tightened his grip on the chalk. His mind replayed the sting of teachers dismissing him, classmates laughing, judges doubting. Every memory sharpened the fire in his chest. The equation on the board wasn't just an academic trap. It was a mirror reflecting every dismissal he had ever faced. Professor Hale leaned against the desk, arms folded, eyes narrowed with expectation. The silence was suffocating. Jamal knew what he was waiting for. The stumble, the hesitation, the collapse. Instead, Jamal inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He was no longer the child ignored in classrooms, or the boy whispered about in competitions. He was the young man who had clawed his way here, who had earned every step despite the system's best efforts to push him down. But as he prepared to make his first move on the board, a thought pierced through him, sudden, unexpected, chilling. What if the professor wasn't just trying to humiliate him? What if this was bigger than one equation? Bigger than one class. Jamal's stomach tightened as his mind raced back to every past humiliation. Every door nearly closed, while Professor Hale's cold stare locked on him, waiting, almost daring him to fail. The lecture hall felt like it was closing in on Jamal, rows of faces angled downward, every gaze funneling toward him as though the spotlight had been fixed on only one student. The board in front of him was a battlefield, and chalk the only weapon he had been allowed. The professor's trap wasn't hidden anymore. It was displayed in plain sight, daring anyone to approach, daring him most of all. Professor Hale's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, his tone polished with feigned neutrality. "Why don't you enlighten us?" There was no kindness in his invitation. The professor already knew none of the others would step forward. The equation itself was enough to paralyze ambition. Stacked with contradictions, designed to collapse, any attempt would look like incompetence, and no student wanted that stain on their record. Yet somehow it had been delivered directly to Jamal, as if the room had been waiting for his downfall long before today. The hush became oppressive. Pens stopped moving. Laptops were pushed aside. Even the restless hum of air vents seemed quieter. Jamal felt every stereotype gathering around him like smoke. That black students in advanced classes were charity admits. That scholarships for people like him were handed out of pity rather than merit. That he was occupying a seat someone else more deserving should have had. He'd heard the whispers before, caught fragments of conversations behind his back, sensed the resentment of classmates who didn't believe he belonged here. Now all of those assumptions sat in the room like spectators, waiting to be confirmed with one inevitable mistake. A student in the front row leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "He's gonna mess this up." Another chuckled under his breath. The laughter was soft, but it carried, sharp as glass. Jamal caught it, though he didn't flinch. He had learned long ago not to. Inside, though, his chest was tight. He looked again at the equation. Its structure was cruel in its elegance. On the surface it seemed solvable, enticing anyone bold enough to try. But as the steps unfolded, it would inevitably break, exposing whoever dared to continue. It wasn't just a problem, it was a public execution wrapped in symbols. Professor Hale stood with arms folded, his smirk restrained but unmistakable. He had set this trap before. Stories about him floated across campus. A Latina student the semester prior had been called to the board for a similarly impossible task. She left the room in tears, and rumor had it she switched majors weeks later. Hale's lessons weren't only in math. They were in power, humiliation, and hierarchy. And now, Jamal was next. He inhaled, steadying himself. Fear wanted to creep in, but something else rose stronger. The memory of nights hunched over second-hand textbooks, the sound of his mother's weary encouragement, his grandmother's unwavering conviction that brilliance in him was real. He remembered, too, the sting of being told don't aim too high, by a counselor who doubted him, the smirk of a competitor who said, "You don't look like you belong here at a math competition." Every insult, every dismissal gathered now, fueling not his shame but his resolve. Jamal lifted his chin. "All right," he said softly. His voice wasn't loud, but the weight of it made the room lean closer. Professor Hale raised an eyebrow. "Excellent," he said, as though the outcome were already written. The equation glared back at Jamal like a sneer carved in chalk. His fingers tightened around the brittle stick. The silence of the room was broken only by the shifting of bodies, students leaning forward, hungry for spectacle. They weren't rooting for him. They weren't hoping to be inspired. They were waiting to confirm their suspicions, to watch genius become fraud, to leave with a story about how the scholarship kid fell apart under pressure. And yet, a small flicker of something unexpected appeared in the crowd. In the back row, Emily Rhodes, the quiet girl who rarely spoke, had her eyes locked on the board, not Jamal. Her expression wasn't mocking or cruel. It was curious, almost concerned. She seemed to sense what others didn't, that something about the professor's challenge wasn't fair. Still, the rest of the room was already writing Jamal's story in their minds. One mistake, one hesitation, and he would be cemented as a failure. The professor leaned against the desk, pretending patience. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Carter," he said smoothly. Jamal studied the equation one last time. He could already see where it would collapse, the point at which anyone unaware of the flaw would be trapped. A cruel puzzle disguised as pedagogy. He could either walk away, confirming the whispers, or step into the fire and risk burning. He remembered his grandmother's voice. "They will doubt you before you open your mouth, but brilliance doesn't need permission." He inhaled again, filling his lungs with determination. Then he stepped forward, closing the space between himself and the board. The chalk felt small, fragile, yet heavy with expectation. The first touch of white dust against black slate echoed in the hall, a sound so ordinary, yet so sharp it sliced through the silence. Students straightened, breath held, waiting for the stumble they thought inevitable. Jamal didn't look back. He didn't glance at the smirks or at Hale's watchful eyes. He looked only at the board, the battlefield of symbols. His hand moved, deliberate, steady. Each stroke of chalk carried not just logic, but defiance. He wasn't solving a problem. He was dismantling a trap. And for the first time, a ripple of uncertainty flickered across the room. With the weight of the entire classroom pressing down, Jamal stepped closer to the board, chalk in hand, and began to write, not just numbers, but the opening line of a defiance none of them expected. The chalk trembled only slightly in Jamal's fingers as he faced the board, but his mind was still, like the eye of a storm. Behind him, rows of students leaned forward, ready for the collapse. They weren't watching for brilliance. They were watching for confirmation. A stumble, a smudge, one misplaced number. That was all it would take for whispers to turn into certainty. He didn't belong. But Jamal wasn't thinking of them. His eyes traced the sprawl of symbols with surgical precision. To anyone else, the equation looked like chaos stitched together with arrogance. To him, it was a rigged game. The flaw wasn't hidden deep. It was deliberately woven in, a baited snare waiting to catch the unsuspecting. He saw it instantly. The construction of the equation created a circular dependency, a place where the logic looped back on itself, until the problem collapsed. It wasn't unsolvable, not exactly. It was designed to make anyone who touched it look incompetent. But where others saw collapse, Jamal saw opportunity. If he shifted the framework, if he restructured the logic, he could turn the broken path into something whole. Behind him, the whispers began again. He's hesitating. Told you. He doesn't know what he's doing. Jamal pressed the chalk against the slate and drew the first line. His movement was calm, deliberate, almost painfully slow. Students frowned. They had expected fumbling or panic, but his strokes were steady. Controlled. The sound of chalk dragging against slate filled the silence, sharp and clear, like the ticking of a clock. Step by step, he began unraveling the professor's trap. First, he rewrote the equation in simpler terms, breaking apart its tangled structure. Then he started building it back up with adjustments, not correcting the professor's mistake outright, but reshaping the path so that it could lead somewhere meaningful. At first, the class laughed. A boy in the second row smirked and muttered, "He's rewriting it. He doesn't even know where to start." But as the minutes stretched, the laughter grew uneasy. Jamal wasn't scribbling randomly. His steps flowed into one another with quiet confidence. Each new line illuminated the last, and slowly the chaos began to look like order. For Jamal, the classroom faded away. He was no longer in the suffocating space of judgment. He was back in his childhood bedroom, pencil scratching across scraps of paper, teaching himself calculus by the faint light of a street lamp outside his window. He was at the library, flipping through borrowed textbooks while ignoring the stares of strangers. He was at the state competition, solving problems faster than anyone else, his hands moving with the same precision they moved now. Numbers had always been his sanctuary, the one place where the noise of the world couldn't follow. They didn't care about skin color, accent, or background. They were honest in a way people often weren't. And in this moment, the sanctuary held him steady. The board filled with symbols. Students shifted uncomfortably. They were no longer smirking. Some furrowed their brows, trying to follow his steps, realizing he was pulling the equation into a shape that made sense. A girl whispered, "Wait, he's actually doing it." A boy further back shook his head, unwilling to accept it. "No, it's a trick. He's just making it look neat." But neatness wasn't what they were seeing. It was precision. Jamal paused briefly, wiping the sweat from his brow. The chalk dust clung to his fingertips, leaving faint smudges against his dark skin. He pressed forward, undeterred, building toward the critical point. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. His world had narrowed to the white streaks on the board, to the rhythm of logic unfolding beneath his hand. Even Emily Rhodes, quiet as she usually was, sat straighter, her eyes darting from line to line. She wasn't smiling, but her gaze carried something else. Recognition. She could see what the others couldn't yet admit. Jamal wasn't floundering. He was dismantling the trap from within, and with each step the atmosphere in the room changed. The laughter died. The smirks faded. Silence grew heavy, taut with disbelief. They weren't watching a boy stumble. They were watching someone bend the impossible back into order. Professor Hale's jaw tightened, though his expression remained carefully composed. He had seen this before. Students who tried to fight the trap, to make sense of the impossible. They always collapsed eventually, their pride leading them into deeper humiliation. Yet something about Jamal's calmness unsettled him. Minutes passed. The board was nearly full. Lines crisscrossing, steps flowing like a river carving through stone. Jamal's hand never wavered. Every mark was exact, purposeful. Then came the turning point. Jamal reached the flaw, the place where the logic folded in on itself, the place where anyone else would have stopped, where Hale expected him to freeze. He didn't freeze. He paused. Yes, long enough for the room to hold its breath, then shifted his approach. Instead of forcing the equation forward, he pulled it backward, dissecting its foundation, exposing the circular logic for all to see. His strokes grew sharper, his movements more confident. He wasn't trapped by the flaw, he was using it. Murmurs rippled through the room. Students exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, "He's not supposed to be able to do that." Another hissed, "How's he seeing this?" The tension grew unbearable. Every second Jamal stood unbroken was another second the stereotypes cracked under the weight of reality. Finally, he approached the end. The structure he had built on the board was solid, undeniable. He was seconds from writing the last piece, the resolution that would prove he had not only seen through the trap, but conquered it. And that's when it happened. Professor Hale, who had remained silent for most of the demonstration, suddenly chuckled. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and mocking. It cut through the air like a blade, shattering the fragile silence that had begun to favor Jamal. "Amusing," Hale said loudly enough for the whole class to hear. "Truly amusing." The words dripped with dismissal, as though the work filling the board were nothing more than a child's drawing. His laughter echoed in the stillness, a cruel reminder of power. Students glanced between Jamal and the professor, uncertain again. For a brief moment, their silence had leaned toward respect. Now, Hale's mockery pulled them back into hesitation. Was Jamal really solving it, or was he just entertaining them with theatrics? Jamal's hand froze mid-air, chalk suspended just before the final step. His chest tightened, not with fear but with anger carefully buried beneath years of practice. The solution was right there, complete, undeniable, yet the professor's laugh threatened to erase it before it could be born. Jamal tightened his grip on the chalk, the final stroke hovering inches away, as Professor Hale's mocking laugh filled the lecture hall, daring him to continue. The chalk hovered in Jamal's hand, the final stroke suspended inches from the board. His breathing was steady, though inside him a storm roared, a storm built from years of silenced brilliance, for nights spent proving himself only to be doubted again. He could see the conclusion forming, sharp and undeniable. One last step, and the equation designed to humiliate him would collapse not into chaos, but into order. But before the chalk could move, laughter sliced through the air. Professor Hale's chuckle had turned into a full dismissal, sharp and decisive. He raised his hand, waving Jamal off as if brushing away a nuisance. "That's enough, Carter," Hale said, his voice laced with finality. "We don't need to waste any more of the class's time." The words cracked like a whip. Jamal froze, chalk still pressed against the slate, his almost complete solution gleaming across the board. A ripple of nervous laughter followed from the students. It wasn't the joyful kind. It was hesitant, uncertain, an echo of authority rather than genuine amusement. Most weren't laughing at Jamal's work. They were laughing because Hale had signaled it was safe to do so. Jamal lowered the chalk slowly, his eyes still fixed on the board. He wanted to scream, to point at the logic etched across the slate, to force them to look. Every line connected. Every piece of reasoning flowed. It was all there, undeniable to anyone willing to see, but the professor never looked. Hale turned his back casually, brushing chalk dust from his hands, as though the problem itself were beneath his notice. "Mathematics," he said, pacing in front of the desk, "is about discipline, about precision. It's not about improvisation." He gestured vaguely at the board, his tone dripping with mockery. "Whatever Carter attempted there is meaningless without rigor. This is why not everyone is cut out for advanced mathematics." The class shifted uneasily. Some nodded, eager to align themselves with authority. Others glanced at the board, frowning. They could see it. Even if they didn't fully understand the steps, they sensed coherence. Jamal's work wasn't random. It had structure, rhythm, and logic. Still, the professor's dismissal carried weight. Most students let their doubt crumble under Hale's certainty. For Jamal, the dismissal was more than a single moment. It was an echo, the echo of every time his brilliance had been ignored because of who he was. He felt it reverberate from his childhood classrooms, from competitions where his victories were met with suspicion, from teachers who praised him only in whispers but never in front of others. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. The sting wasn't just academic, it was deeply personal. He had walked straight into a trap, dismantled it piece by piece, only to be brushed aside as if he had written gibberish. Inside him, two voices clashed. One urged him to sit down, to swallow the humiliation quietly, to let the moment pass. The other, stronger, sharper, told him not to let his work be erased. He turned toward Hale, his voice low but steady. "With respect, sir, if you'd look at the board, you'd see the steps are consistent." The room fell silent again. No one spoke against Hale. Ever. The professor's authority was rarely challenged, and never by someone like Jamal. Hale's smile was tight, condescending. "Consistency," he repeated, his tone mocking the word. "You confuse creativity with correctness. There's no value in arriving at the wrong answer beautifully. Carter, mathematics is not art." The dismissal landed heavy. A boy in the front row chuckled, emboldened now. "Guess he thought it was." The room rippled with restrained laughter. Jamal felt his stomach twist, the weight of their ridicule pressing down. Yet even through the sting, he could see the truth etched on the board. His truth, his proof, undeniable, if only they dared look. And then, quietly, near the back of the room, a student reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. His movements were discreet, almost hidden beneath the desk, but his camera lens tilted upward. He wasn't laughing, wasn't smirking. He was watching Jamal's steps, watching Hale's dismissal, recording the board in silence. The glow of the phone's screen reflected faintly against his face. No one noticed. Not Hale, not the others. The boy stayed quiet, his expression unreadable, but his phone captured everything. The tangled equation rewritten into clarity, the flaw exposed, the proof that Jamal hadn't floundered at all. Meanwhile, Jamal stood frozen, humiliated but unbroken. His chest rose and fell heavily as he returned the chalk to the tray. The sound of it clinking against wood echoed louder than it should have, like punctuation to an unfinished sentence. Hale clapped his hands together, moving on briskly as if nothing had happened. "Now let's return to proper methods. Who can tell me the foundational error here?" His eyes skimmed the room but deliberately avoided Jamal. Students rustled papers, the moment already fading in their minds. To them, authority had spoken. To them, the truth on the board mattered less than the professor's word. But not to everyone. Emily Rhodes sat still, her eyes flicking from the board to Jamal, then back to Hale. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been quiet all semester, but something in her posture now suggested she wasn't convinced. She saw what others refused to. Hale hadn't refuted Jamal's work. He hadn't even looked. Jamal returned to his seat, the weight of humiliation pressing down with every step. The whispers around him stung, sharp and cutting. "Told you. Doesn't even make sense. Scholarship wasted." He sat down slowly, refusing to lower his gaze. His hands trembled slightly under the desk, hidden from view, but his jaw was clenched. Inside, though, a different fire burned. The professor's dismissal had cut him deeply, but it had also confirmed something he had always known. Brilliance, when it came from someone like him, was often invisible by design. Yet invisibility didn't mean non-existence. The chalk still glistened on the board, the logic still stood, and somewhere in the room, unseen, a phone had captured it all. As Jamal sat in silence, humiliated yet burning with quiet defiance, one student in the back lowered his phone, having discreetly recorded every step, sensing that history had just unfolded in that classroom. The sound of laughter still echoed faintly in Jamal's ears. As he sat back down, the chalk dust from his fingers lingering like a reminder that his work was still written across the board. His heart thudded heavily against his ribs, not from embarrassment alone, but from something deeper, heavier, the familiarity of it all. This wasn't the first time his brilliance had been erased. It wasn't even the 100th. As the professor droned on about proper methods, carefully steering the class away from Jamal's solution. Jamal's mind drifted backward, unspooling memories that were less like recollections and more like old wounds being pressed open. He was 9 years old again, hand raised in a classroom that smelled faintly of chalk and floor wax. His teacher, Mrs. Henley, stood at the board, struggling through a math problem she had written incorrectly. Jamal knew the error instantly. Numbers spoke to him like second nature, and he had raised his hand, excited to correct it. But Mrs. Henley never called on him. She glanced over his small brown hand, eyes sliding past him like glass, and chose another student instead. The wrong answer was praised for its effort, and Jamal's hand lowered quietly back to his desk. He had told his mother about it that night, his small voice trembling with frustration. She had cupped his face gently, brushing his curls back from his forehead. "Sometimes, baby," she whispered, "people don't want to see you, but you can't stop shining just because they look away." He had believed her, but the erasures didn't stop. In middle school, Jamal had been the only black student in the advanced math group. During a district-wide test, he finished early, his answers neat and precise. When results came back, his score was the highest in the room. Instead of congratulating him, his teacher asked to see his paper privately. She flipped through it with a frown, questioning him about nearly every step. "Are you sure you did this on your own?" she asked, suspicion dripping from her tone. Jamal nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained. The next week she suggested he focus more on sports, something that fits you better. He never forgot the sting of that phrase, something that fits you better. By high school, the pattern had calcified. Counselors told him not to aim for certain colleges. Classmates laughed when he corrected teachers in class, calling him show-off or know-it-all, but always with an edge, as though intelligence coming from him was arrogance rather than ability. Even his victories were stolen. After winning first place at a math league competition, another student's parent had pulled the judge aside to ask whether Jamal had been given special help. Every dismissal left a scar, and now, staring at the chalkboard where his solution still stood, bold, meticulous, unfinished only because Hale had cut it short, Jamal felt the weight of all those scars pressing on him. This wasn't just about one equation. It was about a lifetime of being unseen even when his brilliance was undeniable. Around him, students scribbled notes, though many kept glancing up at the board. The lines Jamal had written were too sharp to be ignored, even if they didn't fully understand. Some recognized structure where there should have been collapse. Their pens hesitated, unsure whether to trust their own eyes or the professor's dismissal. Jamal's chest tightened. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. He wanted to shout, to force them all to see, to demand that Hale acknowledge what was right in front of them. But he had learned long ago that anger was a weapon that could backfire. One outburst, and they would paint him as emotional, unprofessional, unfit. So he breathed slowly, gathering the fire inside him into something sharper. Not a blaze of rage, a blade of resolve. Hale, meanwhile, paced the front of the classroom with smug composure. "You see," he said, gesturing to the equation, "what Mr. Carter attempted here is a classic mistake. Overconfidence leads to sloppiness. In higher mathematics, precision is everything. Without discipline, effort means nothing." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they were calculated to wound. He hadn't looked at the board, not once, yet he was dismantling Jamal's credibility as though facts mattered less than perception. The whispers picked up again. He thought he had it. Guess Hale showed him. Figures. But not everyone was convinced. Emily Rhodes's eyes flickered from Hale to Jamal, and then back to the board. She frowned, her pen unmoving, as though she couldn't quite reconcile the professor's dismissal with the order she could see in Jamal's work. Jamal clenched his fists under the desk. He thought of his grandmother, who once told him, "If you don't fight for your voice, they'll bury it before you ever speak." And suddenly something inside him shifted. For years he had accepted erasure in silence. He had swallowed the sting, buried the frustration, convinced himself that survival meant enduring. But sitting here now, humiliated once more while his solution gleamed unacknowledged on the board, he realized silence had never protected him. It had only emboldened those who erased him. This time, he wouldn't let it stand. The thought startled even him. Jamal wasn't confrontational by nature. He had built his life on quiet perseverance, proving himself again and again through results. But as Hale's voice droned on, dismissing him without a glance, Jamal knew the old approach wasn't enough. He had to claim his space. Slowly, he raised his hand, His voice, when it came, was calm but unwavering. "Professor Hale," he said, cutting through the rhythm of the lecture, "I think it would only be fair to verify the solution on the board before dismissing it." The room froze. Every head turned, eyes widening. Students weren't used to challenges here. Not in this hall. Not against Hale. A murmur rippled. Half shock, half disbelief. Hale stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. He turned toward Jamal, his smile gone, his posture stiffening. For the first time that morning, he actually looked at the board, not to study it, but to glare at the audacity of the request. Jamal held his gaze, his voice steady. "If it's wrong, you can show us where. But I believe the steps are consistent." The silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Hale's jaw twitched, his eyes darkening. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by someone like Jamal. The class waited, breathless, caught between fear of Hale's authority and curiosity about what might happen next. Some leaned forward, almost eager for the clash. Others looked away, as if afraid to witness it. Emily's pen tapped against her desk, the faint sound betraying her tension. And Jamal, heart pounding, sat tall. He had refused to walk away. Hale's eyes locked on him, sharp and cold, as Jamal calmly insisted that his solution be verified, a demand that threatened to unravel the professor's control over the entire room. The silence that followed Jamal's calm insistence was thick enough to choke on. His words still hung in the air, bold and dangerous. Verify the solution. No one had ever spoken to Professor Hale like that in his own classroom. The walls themselves seemed to recoil at the challenge. Hale stood rigid, his eyes locked on Jamal. His lips tightened into a thin line, the faintest tremor of indignation rippling across his face. He wasn't used to defiance. He was used to obedience. Students nodding even when they disagreed, laughing at his jokes, absorbing his words as gospel. Now before him, a student he had targeted stood unflinching, daring him to look at the truth written on the board. A hush spread through the lecture hall. Some students leaned back, wanting no part in what was about to unfold. Others leaned forward, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear, drawn to the confrontation like moths to flame. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly enough to interrupt the charged silence. Hale finally broke it with a clipped laugh, more bark than humor. "Verify," he repeated, his voice sharp. "Mr. Carter, I've been teaching mathematics longer than you've been alive. I know when work is nonsense." His tone was final, the conversation meant to be closed. Authority was his shield, and he wielded it effortlessly. Jamal didn't back down. He didn't raise his voice either. "Then it should be simple to point out where it went wrong," he said evenly. His voice was low, steady, almost disarming in its lack of anger. The room trembled with the unspoken tension. Hale's authority had been questioned openly, and the class sat suspended between two possibilities: that Hale's dismissal was absolute truth, or that Jamal's challenge carried weight. And then, unexpectedly, a new voice cracked through the stillness. I think his steps make sense." The words were soft, tentative, but they echoed in the quiet hall like a stone dropped into water. Heads swiveled toward the source. Emily Rhodes, the quiet girl in the back row who rarely spoke. Her blonde hair fell across her face as she adjusted her glasses nervously. Her cheeks flushed with the weight of sudden attention. She rarely participated. In a room where louder voices dominated, she had always faded into the background, quietly scribbling notes, keeping her observations to herself. But now, her voice carried farther than she expected, trembling yet unshakable in its conviction. Hale's eyes narrowed. "Miss Rhodes," he said slowly, as though tasting her name with disdain, "you believe Carter's improvisation has merit." Emily swallowed hard, her pen clutched tightly in her fingers. "Yes," she said, barely louder than before. "His steps are consistent. They follow a logical path. It doesn't look like nonsense to me." The room erupted in murmurs. Students glanced at one another, whispers darting across the rows like sparks. For the first time, Hale's absolute authority wavered. Jamal turned slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting Emily's. He didn't speak, but a flicker of gratitude passed between them. Her support, however small, was a crack in the wall that had stood so firmly against him. Hale, however, saw it differently. His face hardened, his jaw clenching. He wasn't simply facing defiance from one student now. It was spreading, however, faintly. If one voice dared to question him, others might follow. He couldn't allow it. Consistency does not equal correctness. he said sharply, his voice louder now, filling the hall with manufactured authority. Miss Rhodes, you are mistaking form for substance. Mr. Carter's so-called solution is nothing more than a creative detour, impressive to the untrained eye perhaps, but mathematically meaningless. His words were aimed not at Emily, but at the entire class. He wanted to pull them back to his side, to remind them of the hierarchy, his word above all. But the silence that followed wasn't as obedient as before. Students hesitated. Some glanced at the board again, then at Jamal, then back at Hale. Doubt had been planted. Emily's voice, though quiet, had carried weight because it wasn't expected. She wasn't Jamal's friend. She wasn't outspoken. She wasn't rebellious. She was invisible in the way many quiet students were, and yet her voice had landed like a tremor in the foundation of Hale's authority. Hale's expression darkened further. He turned back toward the board, finally allowing his eyes to flick across Jamal's work. He didn't study it, not really. His glance was cursory, dismissive, but it betrayed something the students weren't supposed to see. Hesitation, a flicker of recognition that the lines did in fact hold coherence. Jamal saw it. Emily saw it. A few others did too. But Hale straightened quickly, his mask snapping back into place. This is not a debate, he said coldly. This is my classroom. If every fanciful attempt at solving an equation were treated as valid, we'd descend into chaos. We teach discipline here, and Carter's work is not disciplined. Jamal's jaw tightened. He could feel the sting of dismissal again. But this time, something inside him was steadied by Emily's words. For the first time, he wasn't completely alone. Emily, her voice trembling but firm, spoke once more. With respect, Professor, isn't discipline about following logic? He did. The logic holds. A wave of murmurs surged through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The balance was shifting, even if subtly. Hale's eyes snapped to her, his expression cold and unyielding. For a brief second, the mask slipped, and the class saw something they hadn't before. Not authority, not composure, but fear. Fear of losing control. And then his expression hardened, the mask replaced with steel. He would not bend. He could not. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't submission, it was tension. A rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Jamal sat straighter, his pulse steady. He had faced Hale's dismissal, the sting of laughter, the weight of erasure. Now, for the first time, the tide had shifted, however slightly. Someone else had spoken for him, not against him. Emily stared at the board, her pen unmoving, her jaw tight with resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Her voice had been small, but its impact reverberated across the room. And Hale, standing at the front of the class, felt the ground beneath him shift. His authority, once unquestioned, now trembled under the weight of a single quiet voice. The professor's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing, as the first crack in his authority appeared, a small trembling voice that dared to stand against him. The weight of Emily's words still lingered in the air, fragile yet unshakable. Jamal felt them like a lifeline, the faintest crack of light breaking through a wall that had stood against him all his life. For the first time, the silence in the room didn't feel entirely hostile. Doubt had entered the space, not in him, but in the professor. Hale's jaw had hardened, his expression carved into something cold and rigid. He thought silence and dismissal would reclaim his power, but Emily's small defiance had shifted the balance. Jamal sensed the change, subtle but undeniable. The class no longer sat in perfect alignment with Hale's authority. There was hesitation now, eyes darting between teacher and student, an invisible scale wobbling under the weight of truth. Jamal leaned forward, gripping the desk. His humiliation from earlier still burned, but beneath it was something sharper, a resolve that demanded action. He couldn't let his work remain unfinished, dismissed as nonsense. His grandmother's words echoed in him. If you don't fight for your voice, they'll bury it before you ever speak. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. The wood of the chair scraped against the floor, the sound startling in the tense quiet. All eyes followed him as he walked back toward the board. Hale's voice cracked like a whip. Sit down, Carter. The matter is closed. But Jamal didn't sit. His voice came steady, firm, without being loud. With respect, Professor, it isn't closed until the equation itself is closed. Let me show you. The audacity left the room breathless. Hale's eyes narrowed, fury flashing, but he didn't stop Jamal quickly enough. By the time the professor stepped forward, Jamal had already picked up the chalk. The board still carried his earlier work, The lines of logic Hale had brushed off. Jamal stood before it like a man facing judgment. But this time he didn't tremble. He had nothing left to lose. He pressed the chalk against slate and drew the first line backward. A murmur rippled through the room. Students leaned forward, watching with wide eyes. They hadn't expected him to return, not after Hale's dismissal, not after the laughter. But Jamal wasn't just continuing, he was dismantling the equation in reverse, tracing it back to its flawed foundation. At first the steps looked strange, even counterintuitive. Some students frowned, trying to follow. But then patterns began to emerge. The flaw Hale had embedded wasn't hidden in the end. It was woven into the start. By reversing the problem, Jamal revealed it for everyone to see. It loops, he said quietly, the chalk clicking against the board. Here, it folds back on itself, making the rest impossible. The equation isn't unsolvable. It's sabotaged. Gasps spread across the room. A boy in the second row muttered, "Wait, he's right." Another whispered, "No way." For years Hale's word had been absolute, but now his carefully designed trap was unraveling under the steady hand of a student he had tried to humiliate. Jamal didn't gloat. He didn't even turn around. His focus was absolute, his strokes precise, each line exposing another layer of the deception. He spoke as he worked, not to mock Hale, but to make the truth undeniable. When you reverse it, Jamal explained, you see the contradiction. It's deliberate. That's why anyone solving it straight through would collapse. He paused, circling a section with the chalk. It was never about solving math. It was about making someone look like they couldn't. The silence that followed was deafening. The truth hung heavy, dangerous, undeniable. Students looked from the board to Hale, their certainty cracking. Emily leaned forward, her voice breaking the hush. "He's showing the flaw," she said softly. "He's not wrong." Hale's face darkened. His hands tightened behind his back, his knuckles white. He had underestimated Jamal, believing humiliation would be swift and final. But now, the very trap he had built was turning against him. For the students, it was a moment of revelation. The smirks and whispers from earlier dissolved into something else: awe, disbelief, unease. The stereotypes they had leaned on, the assumptions they had carried, were unraveling just as quickly as the professor's equation. Jamal reached the end, stepping back slightly to reveal the board in its entirety. His work stretched across the slate in clean, deliberate strokes, a map of logic and defiance. He turned, not to Hale, but to the class. "This isn't nonsense," he said quietly. "It's mathematics, and mathematics doesn't lie. People do." The words landed like a strike. The room was silent, every student frozen, processing the audacity of what they were witnessing. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again. But this time they weren't mocking. They were questions, whispers of doubt, directed not at Jamal but at Hale. Did he just prove it? Looks like it. Professor didn't say anything. Emily's eyes met Jamal's, and for the first time that morning, a faint smile flickered at the edge of her lips. But Hale could not allow this. His authority wasn't built on fairness, it was built on control. And now in front of dozens of students, control was slipping through his fingers. He felt it in the shifting silence, in the way their eyes no longer held unquestioned obedience. He stepped forward abruptly, his shoes echoing against the floor. His face was red now, his composure cracking. "Enough," he barked. The class jumped, startled. Jamal froze, the chalk still in his hand. Hale stormed closer, his voice sharp with fury. "This is not your lecture, Carter. This is not your classroom. You do not get to rewrite my lesson with your theatrics." He reached out suddenly, his hand ripping the chalk from Jamal's grasp. The brittle stick snapped in two, dust scattering across the floor. Gasps filled the room. Students sat rigid, stunned at the professor's outburst. Jamal's hand hung empty, his chest tight, but his eyes remained steady. He had revealed the flaw, exposed the sabotage, and though Hale had stolen the chalk, he couldn't erase what everyone had already seen. Furious and desperate, Professor Hale ripped the chalk from Jamal's hand, snapping it in two, determined to shut him down before the balance of the classroom shifted any further. The chalk dust still floated in the air, drifting down in pale particles that seemed to hang longer than they should. Jamal's hand was empty now, the broken halves of chalk lying on the floor like evidence of something more than a snapped tool, evidence of control violently reasserted. The class sat in stunned silence, the sound of Hale's outburst still reverberating. Some students stared at Jamal with wide eyes. Others glanced quickly back at their notebooks, as though hiding would protect them from being caught in the storm. But no one could deny what they had seen on the board. Jamal didn't move. His chest rose and fell steadily, his gaze fixed on the professor. A silence wasn't submission, it was defiance in its calmest form. His work was still written clearly across the slate. Hale could break chalk, but he couldn't break logic. Hale, however, couldn't let the moment stand. He turned sharply, pacing in front of the board with an energy that betrayed his composure. His voice, when it came, was tight and sharp, but wrapped in the authority that had ruled this room for years. "Let's not be fooled by appearances," he said, gesturing toward the board with contempt. This, his hand sliced through the air, was not the product of original thought. No, this is mimicry. A murmur stirred in the classroom. Hale's eyes cut back to Jamal, narrowing like blades. "Carter, you expect us to believe you conjured that solution on your own? That you somehow saw through an equation designed to collapse? Don't insult this room's intelligence." Jamal's jaw clenched. He had expected dismissal, even ridicule, but this was something sharper. "I solved it," he said evenly, his voice low but carrying. "Every step is mine." Hale barked out a humorless laugh. "Nonsense. You've memorized it. This solution, no doubt, has been floating around the internet. Students like you," he paused, his words cutting with surgical precision, "are very good at finding shortcuts." The words hung heavy, sharper than chalk dust. The implication wasn't just about plagiarism. It was about Jamal's identity. "Students like you." The sting of the phrase struck Jamal like a lash. He had heard it before in different forms. "You people always cheat. You people don't belong here." The stereotype was old, poisonous, and now it had been spoken into the open by the man who controlled his grade, his reputation, his future. The class reacted in fragmented silence. Some students shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Hale and Jamal. A few nodded subtly, aligning themselves with the professor's authority. Others hesitated, unsure, glancing at the board where Jamal's logic still stood undeniable. Emily Rhodes's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Her knuckles whitened around her pen. She looked from Jamal to Hale, her eyes reflecting disbelief at the brazenness of the accusation. Jamal inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had learned long ago that rage was dangerous. It was always waiting to be weaponized against him. Instead, his voice came calm, almost too calm. "If you think I cheated, Professor, then prove it. Show me where my steps don't hold." The class held its breath. Jamal's words cut through the air like steel. Hale's face flushed deeper. He hadn't expected defiance. He had expected shame, silence, the quiet collapse that had silenced so many before. Instead, Jamal stood tall, his voice carrying the steadiness of someone who had lived with doubt so long it had forged into something unshakable. But Hale wasn't finished. He turned to the class, his voice booming with rehearsed certainty. "This is what happens when we lower standards. This is what happens when we pretend talent is everywhere equally. You get parlor tricks, not real scholarship." The words landed like stones. Jamal felt their weight press against his chest, not because they were true, but because of how easily they could be believed. He looked at the faces around him, some skeptical, some sympathetic, but most unwilling to take a stand. It wasn't the first time he had been accused of dishonesty simply for excelling. He remembered the high school competition judge who had eyed his paper with suspicion, asking pointedly if he'd had help. He remembered the teacher who once told him his algebra homework looked too advanced to be his own. And now, here again, his success was being rewritten as fraud. Jamal's voice broke the silence once more, sharper now. "Mathematics doesn't care about who writes it. The steps are on the board. Anyone can follow them. They hold, whether you want to admit it or not." The murmurs swelled again. Some students leaned toward each other, whispering urgently. A boy in the second row frowned at the board, then at Jamal. "It does make sense," he muttered under his breath, though not loud enough for Hale to hear. Hale's eyes flickered. He had heard enough to know doubt was spreading. He clenched his fists behind his back, his voice rising louder, harsher, to reassert control. "Enough of this performance," he snapped. "I will not have my classroom turned into a circus. Carter, sit down before I remove you. And consider yourself warned. Academic dishonesty is a serious offense. If you think parading stolen solutions will earn you credit, you are gravely mistaken." "Sanat!" Gasps rippled across the room. The threat was clear now. Hale wasn't just dismissing Jamal. He was setting the stage to ruin him. Jamal's chest tightened, but he refused to break. His voice, though quiet, cut through Hale's bluster. I didn't cheat, and you know it. The silence that followed was different than before. It was heavier, charged, the kind of silence that signaled something was about to crack. Emily's hand trembled as she finally spoke, her voice soft but audible. Professor Hale, maybe he's right. Maybe we should actually look at the steps. The professor's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle twitched. Miss Rhodes, I will not have students undermining me with baseless speculation. Sit quietly, or you'll join Carter in the disciplinary office. The class recoiled at his tone. Even those who had sided with him shifted uneasily now. The mask of civility had slipped. What remained was raw anger. Jamal stayed seated, but inside him the fire burned brighter. He wasn't alone anymore. Emily's voice was faint, but it mattered. The whispers in the room mattered. For the first time, Hale's authority wasn't ironclad. And then, the unexpected twist. The heavy oak door at the back of the lecture hall creaked open. Hinges groaned, the sound slicing through the charged silence. Footsteps echoed across the threshold, slow, deliberate, unmistakably authoritative. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Michael Harris, the department dean. His sharp eyes swept the room, catching the tension in the air, the chalk dust still lingering, the unfinished work on the board. He had walked in on a storm, and could already sense its weight. I could hear you from the hallway, Dr. Harris said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of authority Hale could never manufacture. The students froze. Hale stiffened. Jamal's pulse quickened. The dean stepped fully into the lecture hall, his gaze fixed on the professor, having overheard just enough of the exchange to know something wasn't right. The sound of Dr. Michael Harris's footsteps carried through the hall like a metronome, deliberate and steady, cutting through the silence that had grown unbearable. Every eye followed him as he entered, his presence reshaping the air of the classroom. He was tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, his silver hair framing a face lined not by weakness but by years of decision-making. Unlike Hale, Harris did not need to shout to command respect. Authority lived in the way he carried himself. Hale straightened, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dean Harris, he said quickly, his voice unnaturally high. What a surprise. I wasn't expecting you today. The dean's gaze moved past him, toward the chalkboard filled with Jamal's intricate solution. The lines stretched across the slate, like a map of defiance, each mark a challenge to the dismissal Hale had issued minutes before. Harris studied it silently for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Jamal. I heard raised voices, Harris said evenly, his tone calm but sharp enough to unsettle. I thought perhaps I should see for myself. His eyes flicked briefly to Hale. It seems I arrived at the right moment. The class sat motionless. No one dared whisper now. Jamal felt the weight of the dean's gaze on him, heavier than any stare yet. He sat straight, his chest tight, but he didn't look away. Hale moved quickly, eager to reclaim the narrative. Dean, I assure you, nothing unusual is happening here. Mr. Carter attempted to improvise an answer to a problem far beyond his level, and I simply corrected the situation before it wasted more of the class's time. A ripple of unease passed through the students. Harris's eyes, however, didn't soften. He turned back to Jamal. Is that true? Jamal inhaled deeply. His voice came quiet but steady. No, sir. I was solving the problem, and I can prove it. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Even those who had sided with Hale earlier leaned forward, tension buzzing through their veins. Hale's smile faltered. With all due respect, Dean Harris, he said. His words rushed now. This student has clearly memorized some pre-existing solution. These tricks float around the internet, and students like him. He stopped, catching himself too late, the slip of his words landing heavy in the silence. Harris's brow lifted slightly, his eyes hardening. He had heard the phrase students like him. He didn't need further context to understand what Hale meant. Interesting, Harris said softly, his tone colder now. He looked back at Jamal. Tell me, Mr. Carter, if you believe your work is your own, then you won't mind demonstrating again. Here, now. The class shifted uneasily. This was no ordinary request. Harris wasn't asking Jamal to re-explain what was already on the board. He was asking for proof, undeniable, immediate, witnessed by all. Hale smiled faintly, relief flickering in his eyes. This was the test he wanted. Surely the boy couldn't repeat the performance under pressure. Not with the dean watching. Not with the stakes this high. But Jamal didn't hesitate. He rose slowly, his body trembling slightly, but not from fear, from the sheer weight of the moment, pressing down on him. His voice carried clearly, though softer than Hale's booming tone. "I'll do it." The dean nodded once. He picked up a piece of chalk himself, his movements deliberate, and began writing an entirely new equation on the far end of the board. The problem he constructed was complex, layered with variables and abstract functions, something that clearly wasn't lifted from any textbook. When he finished, the board carried another monster, but this one built by fair hands. "There," Harris said, setting the chalk down. He turned to Jamal. "This equation has not been published. It's one of my own constructs. If you can solve this step by step, we'll know the truth." The class held its breath. Hale folded his arms, hiding the sweat beginning to bead at his temples. Jamal stepped forward. The chalk was cool against his fingertips again, brittle but solid. He stared at the problem, letting his mind absorb its shape, its hidden rhythm. It was complicated, far more so than Hale's trap. But unlike Hale's, it wasn't designed to humiliate. It was designed to test, and Jamal welcomed the challenge. He began slowly, rewriting the problem into smaller, manageable forms. His movements were steady, each stroke deliberate, his logic unfolding like a path cut through a dense forest. At first the students whispered again, skeptical, but as the minutes stretched, the skepticism faltered. His process was clean, his reasoning flawless. Where Hale had hoped for collapse, there was clarity. Where Hale had laughed, there was silence. "Notice here," Jamal said softly, circling one portion. "If you factor this term and reverse the substitution, the contradiction resolves." The students leaned forward. Even those who had mocked him earlier now watched with awe. The pattern was undeniable. Jamal wasn't bluffing, wasn't improvising blindly. He was dissecting the problem with precision that left no room for doubt. Emily sat frozen in her seat, her chest tight with nervous anticipation, her eyes locked on Jamal's every move. The boy who had been mocked minutes earlier now stood as if the board itself belonged to him. Hale's smirk had vanished entirely. His face had paled, his jaw tight. He shifted his weight, his foot tapping quietly against the floor. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The board filled with Jamal's work, each line flowing seamlessly into the next. His back glistened faintly with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his hand never faltered. Finally, he placed the chalk down, stepping back to reveal the completed solution. Every line connected, every contradiction resolved. It was clean, airtight, undeniable. The class erupted in murmurs. "He did it. That's crazy. He's brilliant," Emily whispered under her breath, almost to herself. "He proved it." Dean Harris stepped forward, studying the board carefully. His eyes moved line by line, his sharp mind verifying each step. He paused at one section, tapped the board with his finger, then nodded slowly. "Correct," he said finally, his voice calm but heavy with significance. The word rang through the hall like a bell. Jamal exhaled deeply, his chest loosening for the first time in what felt like hours. He turned, his eyes meeting the dean's, waiting for the verdict to carry more weight than a single word. Harris looked at him with something Hale had never given: respect. "You didn't memorize this," he said quietly. "You solved it." The students sat stunned. Some shifted uncomfortably, their assumptions shattering. Others looked at Jamal with newfound awe, their earlier smirks erased. Emily smiled faintly, pride flickering in her eyes. But Hale stood frozen. His face was pale, his composure cracked. He had been exposed in front of everyone. Yet, even in the face of undeniable truth, his mind twisted, desperate for another way to reclaim control. His authority had slipped, but surrender wasn't in his nature. Professor Hale's skin drained of color as the truth settled over the room. Jamal had passed the dean's impossible test, but instead of surrendering, his eyes darkened, already plotting another attack. The word correct still echoed in the lecture hall, carrying a weight that silenced even the most skeptical students. Dean Harris's validation of Jamal's solution was undeniable. Jamal had stood before the room, dismantled one trap, solved another, and emerged not just intact but brilliant. For a moment the air felt different, lighter, charged with the possibility that truth could prevail over prejudice. But the look on Professor Hale's face told another story. He stood in the corner of the room, pale beneath the fluorescent lights, His jaw clenched so tightly the muscle twitched. His authority had been punctured, not just in whispers but in full view of the dean and an entire class. Students were murmuring with something dangerously close to admiration for Jamal. Respect was shifting, and Hale felt it like a noose tightening around his neck. Outwardly, he maintained composure, dismissing the class with clipped words and forced calm. Inwardly, his mind was already scheming. Authority lost in the open had to be regained in the shadows. That evening, in the dim glow of his office lamp, Hale sat at his desk with the cold glow of his computer screen illuminating his face. The room was lined with plaques and framed certificates, symbols of the reputation he guarded so fiercely. Yet tonight, all he saw was threat. Jamal, a student who was supposed to be crushed, not elevated, had become a danger. He began typing. The email was carefully crafted, every sentence polished to carry plausible concern, while dripping with quiet accusation. To the Academic Integrity Committee. It has come to my attention that a student in my class, Mr. Jamal Carter, has demonstrated suspicious behavior regarding complex mathematical solutions. His sudden ability to solve advanced equations, particularly ones never formally taught, raises serious questions about the authenticity of his work. While I cannot prove direct misconduct at this moment, I believe it is in the university's best interest to open an inquiry before this becomes a larger issue. Hale leaned back, rereading the words. They were vague enough to avoid scrutiny, but heavy enough to plant seeds of doubt. He didn't need to prove anything outright. He only needed to shift the narrative. He clicked send. By morning, whispers had begun. Jamal noticed it first in the cafeteria line. Two students standing behind him lowered their voices, yet not enough for him to miss their words. Did you hear? They're saying he cheated. Figures. No one just pulls that kind of solution out of nowhere. Jamal froze, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. He turned, but the students avoided his gaze, pretending to scroll through their phones. The words hung heavier than the stares. By afternoon, the whispers had multiplied. In hallways, students glanced his way before leaning into one another with quiet exchanges. Fraud, shortcut, probably memorized it. Some didn't bother whispering. A boy from another department smirked as Jamal passed. Hey genius, what website you pulling those answers from? Laughter followed him down the corridor, hollow and cruel. The sting wasn't new. Suspicion had always followed his victories. But this time it spread faster, sharper, amplified by the institution around him. By evening the storm had reached social media. A post appeared on a student forum. Can we talk about Jamal Carter? Heard from a source he cheated on that big math problem in Hale's class. All things under investigation. The thread exploded with comments. Not surprised. Dude's been playing the system since day one. He doesn't belong here anyway. You can't fake talent forever. Scholarship kids always pull this kind of thing. A few voices tried to defend him. I was in the class. He actually solved it. But those were drowned quickly beneath the avalanche of cynicism, mockery, and thinly veiled racism. By the next morning, Jamal couldn't walk across campus without feeling the weight of it. Eyes lingered on him too long. Conversations hushed when he passed. Even friends from his dorm seemed hesitant, caught between loyalty and fear of association. Emily found him sitting alone, on a bench outside the library, his shoulders hunched, a half-eaten sandwich untouched in his hands. She approached quietly, her voice soft. You've seen it, haven't you? The posts? Jamal didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his eyes were tired, the fire that had carried him through the classroom now dimmed by exhaustion. They already decided I cheated, he said flatly. Doesn't matter what's on the board. Doesn't matter that the dean called it correct. They'll always believe the worst first. Emily sat beside him, her own face pale with frustration. Not everyone believes it. I don't. Some people don't. But it's spreading fast. Jamal shook his head slowly, his voice quieter now. This is how it always happens. You prove yourself, and they move the finish line. You win the game, and they change the rules. His words lingered in the crisp evening air. Emily wanted to argue, to tell him it wouldn't last, but even she knew the truth. Rumors didn't fade, they rooted. Meanwhile, Hale watched the storm grow with satisfaction. He didn't need to fuel it anymore. The institution would take it from here. Doubt, once planted, spread like wildfire. He had turned Jamal's greatest moment into a liability. And then the hammer dropped. 2 days later, Jamal returned to his dorm to find an envelope slipped under his door. His name was printed neatly across the front, in the university's official letterhead. His hands trembled as he opened it, scanning the first line. Mr. Carter, this letter serves as official notice that you are under investigation for potential academic dishonesty. You are required to attend a disciplinary hearing scheduled for next week. Failure to comply may result in suspension or expulsion. The words blurred for a moment as Jamal's vision clouded with disbelief. His chest tightened, breath shallow. Even after proving himself in front of the dean, even after showing the logic step by step, the weight of accusation had found its way to paper. The system had spoken, not in defense of him, but in suspicion. He lowered the letter slowly, his hands trembling. For a moment the room spun with the memories of every erasure before this, every dismissal, every doubt. But this time, it wasn't just whispers. It was official. Jamal stared at the letter in his hands, his stomach hollow, as the words under investigation burned into his mind. The institution itself had now turned against him. The letter lay open on Jamal's desk, its words heavy as stone. Under investigation. The official seal glared back at him like a gavel already struck. He sat motionless, the paper trembling in his hands, the weight of the accusation pressing into his chest. No matter how many times he read it, the meaning didn't change. The university was no longer debating his innocence. It was preparing to judge him. He had known suspicion before, in classrooms, in competitions, in whispered hallways. But this was different. This wasn't a rumor. This was a process, sanctioned and stamped, carrying the power to end everything he had fought for. Emily sat across from him, her face pale, her hands knotted in her lap. She had been there when the whispers started, when social media twisted his name, but even she felt the new weight of the letter. It wasn't just unfair anymore. It was official. They're going to decide without even looking at the truth. Jamal whispered, his voice hoarse. Emily leaned forward, her tone urgent but gentle. Then we make them look. We don't let Hale rewrite this. We gather everything, every piece of proof. If they want evidence, we'll give them more than they can ignore. Jamal looked up, his eyes tired but burning faintly with resolve. Proof, he repeated, as if the word itself might steady him. Emily nodded. Remember Daniel? The guy who recorded your solution that first day? If we can get that video, they'll have to see it. It shows you didn't cheat. It shows Hale shut you down. Jamal blinked, the memory returning. The quiet student near the back, phone angled discreetly while Hale dismissed him. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it felt like a lifeline. They moved quickly. Emily tracked Daniel down in the library, whispering urgently at his table, while Jamal stood nearby, his heart pounding. Daniel hesitated at first, glancing around nervously. It's risky, Daniel murmured. Hale is powerful. If he finds out I shared it, he won't, Emily cut in. But if you don't, they'll ruin Jamal. They'll erase him. Daniel studied Jamal for a long moment, his lips pressed tight. Finally he sighed and pulled out his phone. Fine. But this stays between us. The screen lit up, and there it was. The recording. Blurry from distance, faint with background noise, but clear enough. It showed Jamal at the board, his steady steps, his logic unfolding, and then Hale's interruption, the mocking dismissal, the refusal to look. Jamal's chest loosened for the first time in days. This proves it, he whispered, his voice breaking with relief. Emily smiled faintly. It's enough. With this, they can't ignore you. But even as she said it, Jamal felt the creeping doubt. He had lived too long under the weight of erasure to believe truth alone could save him. Still, it was a weapon, and right now, it was all he had. For the next week, their lives became a countdown. Every day brought new tension, the calendar marching toward the disciplinary hearing like a ticking clock. They gathered everything they could. Notes from classmates who admitted Jamal's logic had made sense. Screenshots of online posts that revealed Hale's smear campaign. Even Emily's own testimony prepared word for word. At night, Jamal lay awake in his dorm bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. He thought of his mother, working double shifts back in Detroit, believing her son was finally safe in a place where brilliance mattered. He thought of his grandmother, her raspy voice telling him brilliance had always lived in him. And now, he feared both their faiths would collapse under an institution eager to believe the worst. Emily checked on him constantly. She carried binders of evidence, organized and highlighted, her determination fierce. They can't bury this, she repeated, as though saying it enough times might make it true. But Jamal knew the truth of the world they lived in. Evidence didn't always win. Sometimes perception mattered more. Sometimes stereotypes drowned facts. Still, he pushed forward, because to stop was to surrender. The night before the hearing, Jamal and Emily sat in the library, their table buried beneath papers, binders, and laptops. Daniel's recording glowed on Emily's phone screen, the video playing again and again, like a talisman. Jamal lay ill at it, watching his own figure move across the board, listening to Hale's mocking laugh. It wasn't perfect proof, but it was true. Emily exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, when they see this, they'll have no choice. They'll see what I saw, what everyone saw. Jamal nodded, though the heaviness in his chest didn't ease. I've heard that before, he said quietly. They'll have no choice. But somehow, they always do. Emily reached across the table, her hand brushing his. Not this time. They left the library close to midnight, exhaustion dragging at their steps. Jamal tucked his notes under his arm, Emily clutching her phone like it was the most precious thing she owned. When morning came, the tension was suffocating. Jamal woke before dawn, his stomach hollow, the letter of investigation still pinned to his desk like a scarlet letter. Emily met him outside, her phone in hand, her jaw tight with determination. But when she unlocked it, her breath caught. The gallery scrolled. The folders opened. The video was gone. Her hands shook as she searched, swiping frantically through files. No, it was right here. She opened the trash folder. Empty. She opened backups. Nothing. Jamal's chest seized, his pulse spiking. What do you mean gone? His voice cracked. Emily's eyes filled with panic. I don't know, it was here last night, I swear it. Someone. She stopped, the thought too heavy to finish. Jamal sank onto the nearest bench, his head in his hands. The one piece of undeniable proof, the lifeline that had kept them moving, had vanished into air. The clock ticked toward the hearing. The evidence they had built now rested on testimony and paper. But the video, the one thing that could silence every doubt, was gone. On the day before the hearing, Emily stared at her empty phone, trembling, as Jamal felt the weight of collapse. The recording that could have saved him had mysteriously vanished. The hearing room was nothing like a classroom. It wasn't lined with eager students or filled with whispered doubts. It was colder, heavier, paneled with dark wood and lit by sterile fluorescent bulbs that gave no comfort. A long rectangular table stretched across the center, and behind it sat the panel, administrators with unreadable expressions, clipboards in hand, pens poised like weapons. Jamal sat at a smaller table opposite them, his shoulders stiff, his heart beating in heavy, uneven rhythms. The letter of investigation lay folded in his pocket, though he could still feel its weight pressing through the fabric. Emily sat beside him, clutching her binder of notes, her jaw tight with determination. At the far side of the room stood Professor Hale, polished and composed. His suit was sharp, his smile faint but confident, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of a man who believed the system was built for him. The chair of the panel, Dr. Park, cleared her throat. Her voice was calm, measured. This hearing concerns allegations of academic dishonesty against Mr. Jamal Carter. We will hear statements from Professor Hale, from Mr. Carter, and from any relevant parties. The goal is to determine whether misconduct has occurred. Jamal's chest tightened. Misconduct. The word felt poisonous, attaching itself to his name. Hale spoke first. He rose with ease, his voice smooth as silk. Members of the board, this is not a matter I bring lightly. Mr. Carter has repeatedly displayed solutions to problems far beyond his coursework. Solutions so advanced, they raise obvious concerns about authenticity. The work in question was suspicious not because it was correct, but because it was too correct, too rehearsed. It mirrored advanced methods circulating online. He let the words hang, his eyes sweeping the panel. I have no doubt Mr. Carter is intelligent. But intelligence and integrity are not the same. The integrity of our institution depends on honesty. And I believe, in this case, honesty is absent. Jamal felt the sting of each word, not because they carried truth, but because of how easily they wrapped themselves in authority. Dr. Park nodded. Thank you, Professor Hale. Mr. Carter, your response. Jamal stood slowly, his palms damp, his throat dry. He wanted to shout, to strip Hale's words bare, but he steadied himself. Anger would only play into the narrative Hale had built for him. My response, Jamal began, his voice quiet but clear, is that I didn't cheat. I didn't memorize anything. I solved those equations because I've worked for years, in libraries, in my bedroom, Under street lamps, when I couldn't afford new books. Numbers have always been my language. They don't come from the internet. They come from me. He paused, glancing at the board members. Their faces remained blank, but he pressed on. I showed my work, step by step. Every line followed from the last. Anyone who looks closely will see the logic holds. If Professor Hale couldn't admit it, that doesn't make it dishonest. It just makes it inconvenient. Emily placed a sheet of paper on the table, sliding it forward. We've prepared supporting notes, she said quickly, her voice trembling but firm. Other students confirmed that Jamal's solution was consistent, and we had a recording that showed him being dismissed before he could finish. Her voice faltered, her eyes dropping briefly. That recording was lost, mysteriously, but we still have testimony. Dr. Park raised an eyebrow. Lost? Emily nodded, her throat tight. Yes, but it existed. I saw it myself. A low murmur spread among the panel, pens scratching against paper. Hale seized the moment. You see, he said smoothly. The so-called evidence disappears. Convenient, isn't it? Just like a magician pulling a coin from behind someone's ear. He smiled faintly, as though the matter were already settled. Jamal's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to the table, his voice firmer now. You keep saying convenient. Do you know what's not convenient? Spending your whole life proving yourself and still being called a fraud. Solving problems no one else will touch. And being told it's too good to be yours. I've lived with that since I was 9 years old. The panel watched him closely now, their pens slowing. Jamal reached for a marker lying on the table. Give me another problem, he said suddenly. Something no one's seen. I'll solve it here, in front of all of you. Step by step. No internet, no recording, just me and the math. The room tensed. It was a bold move, maybe reckless, but Jamal's voice carried the steadiness of someone who had no other choice. Hale's face flickered, not with fear, but with irritation. He stepped forward quickly. This is unnecessary, he said firmly. The board's job is not to entertain stunts. It is to uphold academic integrity. Dr. Park looked between them. Professor Hale, if Mr. Carter is confident in his ability, perhaps a demonstration would be clarifying. Hale's jaw clenched, but he forced a polite nod. If you insist. A problem was written on the whiteboard, a complex construct drawn from abstract algebra, tangled and unfamiliar. Jamal stared at it for a long moment, his pulse racing, then picked up the marker. The room fell silent. He began slowly, carefully. His movements were deliberate, his voice steady as he explained each step aloud. Here the substitution cancels. Here the structure reveals the hidden symmetry. Minutes stretched. The board filled. The panel leaned forward, pens forgotten in their hands. Hale stood stiffly in the corner, his arms folded, his face pale. At last Jamal stepped back. The solution stood complete, every line connected. Dr. Chen, one of the board members, whispered almost involuntarily, "Remarkable." Emily's eyes shone, relief breaking through the tension. Hale's smile had vanished completely. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Dr. Park addressed him directly. Professor Hale, you have accused this student repeatedly, yet you provide no concrete proof of misconduct. You suggest memorization, but you cannot point to a source. You claim dishonesty, yet the logic holds. Her gaze hardened. Do you have any actual evidence, Professor? The silence was suffocating. Hale's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, his authority faltered visibly. Jamal stood taller, his chest rising with something close to pride. For once the balance felt in reach, and then the door creaked open. The sound was small but sharp in the silence. Every head turned. A figure stepped into the room, older, with tired eyes and a folder clutched tightly in hand. His suit was worn, his hair graying, but his presence carried a quiet weight. I have evidence, the man said softly, his voice steady. Evidence about Professor Hale. The panel stirred, surprised. Hale's face drained of color. The man's eyes locked on Hale's, a history unspoken but heavy in the air. My name is Dr. Alonzo Pierce, and I know what it means to be silenced by him. The room froze as Dr. Alonzo Pierce, a former professor with a shadowed past, stepped forward with evidence against Hale, shifting the entire hearing in an instant. The room had been tense before, but with Dr. Alonzo Pierce standing in the doorway, silence became something sharper, a silence that pressed against every chest like weight. His voice, though quiet, carried a gravity that none of Hale's bluster could match. I know what it means to be silenced by him, Pierce repeated, stepping forward with a measured pace. His folder looked ordinary, but in his hands, it felt like a weapon long kept hidden. The panel shifted uneasily. Dr. Park leaned forward, her brow furrowed. Dr. Pierce, she said carefully, this is highly irregular, but given the nature of your statement, I believe we must hear you. Hale's face was drained of color. His polished composure cracked visibly, his lips tightening into a line that betrayed both fear and fury. This is absurd, he snapped. Pierce hasn't taught here in over a decade. He has no standing. Pierce's eyes flicked toward Hale, calm but piercing. Standing or not, I have truth. He set the folder on the table and opened it slowly. Pages of old documents, memos, and emails lay inside, yellowed at the edges but preserved with meticulous care. I left this university, Pierce began, not because I wanted to, but because Professor Hale made it impossible for me to stay. When I began speaking about the systemic barriers facing black students in advanced mathematics, he undermined me. He questioned my competence in front of colleagues. He planted rumors about my research. He built a case against me, not with facts but with influence. Gasps rippled across the room. Pierce's voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. I was silenced. My career here was ended. And I've lived with that stain for years, watching from a distance as students like Jamal Carter faced the same tactics. Intimidation, dismissal, accusations dressed as concern. Emily's chest tightened, her hand clutching her binder until her knuckles turned white. Jamal sat frozen, his eyes locked on Pierce, recognizing in his words the echo of his own life. Hale's voice broke through, sharp and desperate. Lies. All of it. Convenient lies dredged up from the past. He turned to the panel, his tone pleading now. This is a distraction. An attempt to smear me. My record speaks for itself. But the panel didn't look at him the same way anymore. Doubt had settled, and once doubt entered it was hard to shake. Pierce lifted a document from the folder and slid it across the table. This is a faculty memo from 2008. In it, Hale dismisses the recommendations of a scholarship committee that had approved funding for a black student in engineering. He wrote, and I quote, "Students like these rarely excel beyond introductory levels. It would be a wasted investment." The words landed like thunder. Even the board members, trained in neutrality, shifted visibly. Pierce continued. Each page another nail in the coffin. Here, an email exchange where he refers to minority students as quota fillers. Here, a note where he rejected independent study proposals from students of color, only to approve the same topics for white students. Hale's mask shattered. His face reddened. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is character assassination, he shouted. None of this proves Carter's innocence. Jamal finally spoke, his voice low but cutting. It proves a pattern. You've been erasing voices like mine long before I ever walked into your class. The room seemed to tilt. The weight of truth was undeniable now, not just in Jamal's solution on the board, but in Hale's history laid bare. Dr. Park turned to Hale, her voice sharp. Do you deny writing these documents? Hale hesitated, his eyes darting toward the papers, toward Pierce, toward the panel. His silence was louder than any answer. The dean, Dr. Harris, who had entered days earlier as a quiet observer, finally spoke. His voice was calm but steely. I've worked with this department for years, and I've heard whispers, rumors I dismissed as bitterness. Now I see those whispers had teeth. This is not just about Mr. Carter. This is about the integrity of this institution. Hale opened his mouth but no words came. His authority, once untouchable, was gone. Dr. Park looked at Jamal, her voice softer now. Mr. Carter, based on what we've heard today, your name will be cleared. The accusations against you are unfounded. Your record will remain intact. The words struck Jamal like air after drowning. His chest rose, his breath unsteady. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight begin to lift, not completely, but enough to breathe. Emily's eyes filled with tears of relief, her hand reaching for his arm. Dr. Park's voice hardened again. As for Professor Hale, given the evidence presented, you are hereby suspended pending a full review of your conduct. Effective immediately. The silence that followed was electric. Hale's face twisted. A man watching the empire he had built crumble beneath him. He sputtered, his voice rising in desperation. You can't do this. I am this department. You think you can erase me because of one student and a bitter old colleague, Dr. Harris's reply was cold. No, Richard. We're not erasing you. You erased yourself years ago. The words landed like a verdict. Hale stood motionless, his mouth opening and closing without sound. His shoulders slumped, his arrogance deflating. For the first time, he looked small. Jamal sat in stunned silence. He had won. The truth had broken through. His name was cleared. His brilliance, undeniable, yet the victory felt heavy, almost bitter. Because as Pierce's words echoed in his ears, he realized something chilling. He wasn't the first. How many others had been erased quietly, without witnesses, without allies, without recordings? How many voices had been silenced before reaching this point? How many futures had been stolen by the gatekeeper, who had finally fallen? He rose slowly, his legs trembling but steady enough to carry him. Emily walked beside him as he left the hearing room, her eyes bright with relief, but shadowed with the same unspoken question. The corridor outside was quiet, the world still moving as if nothing had changed. Students passed, chatting, laughing, oblivious. But inside Jamal, the victory felt complicated. Justice arrived. Yes, but late, and at a cost he could feel in his bones. Jamal walked out free at last, but a question haunted him. How many others like him had been silenced forever, their brilliance buried by the same system that nearly buried his? The hearing ended with Hale's suspension and Jamal's exoneration. But the days that followed were not a return to normal. There was no such thing as normal after having his name dragged across whispers, posts, and official letters. Yet something had shifted. Where once Jamal walked through the campus hallways under a cloud of suspicion, he now walked with a quiet gravity that made people pause. Weeks later, the decision became public. An official statement was issued. Jamal Carter had been cleared of all charges. His record remained intact. Professor Hale was suspended pending review of professional misconduct. The announcement traveled across campus, reshaping the narrative that had nearly buried him. But Jamal knew victory wasn't the same as healing. The morning he returned to his classroom, not as a student, but as a teaching assistant, he felt a strange mix of triumph and weight. Dean Harris himself had invited him to assist in an advanced mathematics seminar. The gesture wasn't just symbolic, it was recognition, validation. Jamal was no longer the boy being tested, humiliated on the board. He was now the one guiding others. As he stood at the front of the room, the chalk resting between his fingers, a flood of memory returned. The laughter, the whispers, the smirk on Hale's face as he waved him off. The sting of erasure. But the board in front of him wasn't a trap now. It was a canvas. He turned, scanning the room. Dozens of students watched him, their notebooks open, their pens ready. Among them, he noticed faces that reminded him of his younger self. The girl in the back row, hesitant to raise her hand. The boy clutching his notebook tightly as if afraid of being seen. He knew those looks. They were the faces of students who carried brilliance unacknowledged, who feared that no matter what they wrote, no one would read it fairly. Jamal began, his voice steady. Mathematics isn't about being perfect. It isn't about memorizing tricks. It's about seeing patterns where others don't, about refusing to give up when the problem seems impossible. And sometimes, he paused, glancing at the hesitant girl. Sometimes, it's about being brave enough to write on the board, even when you know everyone's waiting for you to fail. The girl's eyes lifted, meeting his. For the first time, she didn't look away. After class, students lingered, something that rarely happened before. A few asked questions. One thanked him quietly before slipping out the door. Jamal stayed behind, answering, listening, encouraging. Each interaction felt like a thread stitching over wounds that still ached, but no longer bled. Outside the classroom, life didn't transform into a fairy tale. Whispers still followed him at times, old rumors lingering like stains that refused to wash out. Online posts still floated, remnants of the smear campaign Hale had set in motion, and Jamal knew the system hadn't changed overnight. But something inside him had shifted. He had been tested not just by an equation, but by an entire structure designed to doubt him. And he hadn't just solved the math. He had solved the trap. He had survived the dismissal, the smear, the hearing. And now, he stood not as the student others doubted, but as the teacher shaping those who came after him. Emily remained by his side, steady and loyal. She teased him once, saying, "You're the only person I know who fought racism with chalk and logic." Jamal had laughed softly at that, but the truth beneath her words stayed with him. His defense hadn't been fists or shouting. It had been numbers, patience, and resilience. One evening, weeks after his reinstatement, Jamal visited the library alone. He walked past the tables where he had once studied unnoticed, past the shelves that had been his silent companions when classrooms failed him. At a quiet corner desk he sat with a notebook open, staring at a fresh page. He thought of Dr. Pierce, the man who had stepped into the hearing carrying scars of his own. How many like Pierce had been silenced without ever returning? How many students like himself had been erased before they had the chance to prove their brilliance? The thought chilled him. He wrote slowly across the page. Brilliance knows no color. The words looked stark against the blankness, fragile yet unyielding. But as he stared at them, another thought pressed harder. And yet, how many never get the chance to show it? The equation of injustice wasn't solved in one classroom or one hearing. It stretched across schools, across institutions, repeating like the loops Hale had hidden in his trap. For every Jamal who fought through, how many had been forced out silently, their gifts buried under someone else's authority? Weeks turned to months, and Jamal continued his work as a teaching assistant. He mentored students quietly, encouraging those who hesitated, protecting those overlooked. He became a lifeline for some, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew what it felt like to be unseen. His reputation grew. Articles surfaced about his story. Some celebrated him as a symbol of resilience. Others twisted the narrative, still clinging to doubt. But Jamal no longer sought to change every mind. He focused instead on the students in front of him, the ones who might carry their own scars into the future if no one believed in them. One evening, after a long day of classes, Emily joined him on the campus steps. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky darken, students hurrying past in laughter and chatter. "You ever think about how close it was?" Emily asked softly. "One missing recording, one wrong word, and they could have erased you." Jamal nodded slowly. "I think about it every day. And I think about the people who didn't get that one person to speak up for them. People who didn't have someone recording. People who just disappeared from the system." Emily's eyes glistened. "But you didn't disappear." "No," Jamal said quietly. "But too many did." He looked out across the campus, his face calm but shadowed with thought. "I solved the equation they put in front of me. But the real equation, the one about justice, that one's still unsolved." The night air grew colder. The campus lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the lawn. Jamal rose slowly, tucking his notebook under his arm. He carried himself differently now, no longer the boy waiting to be tested, but the man who had already proven himself. Yet the question lingered in his chest, heavier than any chalkboard problem. The equation had been solved, but how many other equations of injustice remained unsolved across classrooms and institutions? Hidden traps waiting to erase brilliance before it could even begin. Stories like Jamal's don't just live in classrooms. They happen every day in silence, in workplaces, in schools, in lives erased before they're even seen. His voice broke through, but how many others never get that chance? If you had been in that room watching a professor try to erase a student's brilliance, what would you have done? Comment your answer below. Share the story so more people hear it. And let's make sure no voice is silenced again.